Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our Phil 115 critical thinking class. This is chapter 2, which deals with obstacles to critical thinking. So this is a really important chapter. We could spend an entire quarter just on the material here, as well as discuss the material presented in this chapter in more detail, especially in psychology classes, as well as other philosophy classes. So really important chapter. Many of the examples cataloged in the chapter will come up again in later material, but I really want to stress just how important it is to understand and hopefully combat the obstacles to critical thinking presented in this chapter. But it is not an exhaustive list. There are certainly innumerable ways that we fail to be critical thinkers. So this is not a complete list, but certainly many of the obstacles that we see here in chapter 2 are not only prevalent, but are ones of particular concern in our 21st century digital age. So with that intro out of the way, let's look at the way in which these impediments to critical thinking are cataloged. So the way the book separates them, our chapter, is to separate them into psychological impediments to critical thinking and philosophical impediments to critical thinking. And we'll explain what that difference entails. So in the first category, as the chapter outlines, these are hindrances that arise because of how we think. These are psychological. So what does that mean? This is how our brain works. This is how perhaps evolution and other physiological and biological factors have resulted in the ways that humans think overall. And we tend to study these, as I just mentioned, in the empirical sciences. So clear connection there. Whereas in category 2, these are hindrances that occur because of what we think. These tend to be philosophical. And I like this distinction because in this latter category, these are thought of as specific views that people hold. Whereas in the first category, it's how we think. In the second category, these are views that capture what we think. And so these tend to be philosophical. So we can flesh this out in more detail. One thing that is brought up immediately, and for good reason, is the obstacle known as self-interested thinking. So what is self-interested thinking? Well, as the name implies, this is when we accept a claim solely on the grounds that it advances or coincides with our own interests. Why is that problematic? We might think that it's okay to think about yourself. And of course it is. No one's saying that it's not a right to consider one's own interests. The problem, though, as I'm sure you can surmise, is that self-interest alone, the fact that it helps you, does not establish the truth of a claim. And even if we think otherwise, it doesn't lend more credence to a claim simply because it helps us in terms of its overall truth or whether or not the claim actually helps others or a combination of those. So to base our beliefs on self-interest alone is to run afoul of critical thinking. Now, again, I want to be very clear. It's not that there aren't cases of self-interested thinking that don't yield truth. No one's claiming that. But to base it solely on whether or not it advances your own interests is not to engage in critical thinking. And I think Vaughan is absolutely right with that categorization. So perhaps see if you can pause for a second and think of an example of self-interested thinking. There are plenty of examples, but what's an example of a way in which somebody thinks that is completely self-interested, yet doesn't establish the truth of a particular claim? So actually, let me go over an example that I have later on. So if I made an argument about, let's say, Italian food, because I'm Italian, and then I start making claims about, I don't know, we'll make it very simple. Italian food is the only food sold in Europe. And I think that that's true because I'm Italian. Now, obviously, that's a very simplistic example, but it's pretty obvious that just because I happen to be aligned with that group, or because I might find one kind of food more preferable than others, that does not establish the claim that it's the only food served in Europe. That's quite clearly false. There's lots of great food in Europe, in the US, in Canada, everywhere. So even if I'm tied to that group or that tribe, it does not establish the truth of the claim simply because it advances my own interests. Or I could think of an example as a teacher, or I don't know, depending on perhaps the sport that you like. Just because you are invested in one thing or another does not establish the overall truth of a claim. So there's a couple of really good points here that are brought up in the book. One, we need to be careful when things get very personal. Number two, we need to be aware of the urge to distort our thinking to what's called save face. This is a very common psychological trick. We've all employed it. So when we save face, we are trying to avoid looking guilty, looking bad, culpable. We do this all the time. This is also perhaps thought of as making an excuse. So it could be something like, let's say I'm playing tennis and I totally hit a terrible shot. And then I say, oh, well, I hit that terrible shot because the sun was in my eyes. Even though the sun wasn't actually in my eyes and perhaps it was cloudy, I'm using that to save face in order to not look bad, right? And it's understandable why we do this. We don't like to look bad or at fault or guilty, culpable, right? But we need to be very, very careful about doing this when it comes especially to things that matter a lot. And so we have this psychological tendency to save face when we want to avoid looking culpable. We also want to avoid selective attention, or what we call availability error, which will come up in more detail in a second. And we want to look, as we've already discussed, for opposing evidence. So perhaps see if you can think of an example of saving face, not to be too personal, but perhaps you can think of an example of someone saving face that you know, or perhaps a case where you yourself have used face saving to avoid blame or looking bad or avoiding the truth of the topic. So we can talk more about that in discussion. The other thing that is brought up in this text, this chapter, is the view known as evidentialism. And this is a philosophical position that we could talk in a lot more detail about in a different kind of class. But some philosophers, like W.K. Clifford, famous 19th century philosopher, said famously that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. So Clifford here ties the ethics, the right or wrong of believing in something, with evidence, that it's actually wrong for someone to believe in something that they don't have evidence for. So you can think of an example that might fit Clifford's view here. So if I'm thinking about, I don't know, Bigfoot, Clifford would say, yeah, it's wrong to believe in Bigfoot if there's no evidence for Bigfoot, or it's wrong to believe in any number of conspiracy theories because there's no evidence for them. Well, we can talk more together about whether you think he's right about that. However, I point him out here just to elaborate the fact that in this class and in most philosophy classes in general, we assume this view known as evidentialism, that to believe in something and to have good reasons for believing something, you have to have reasons and evidence to support that view. And we typically think that the stronger the evidence, the stronger the belief, right? So there's plenty of good reasons to think that Earth is the third planet from the sun. We have lots and lots of evidence, whereas the view that the Earth is flat has zero or very little evidence in its favor. So Clifford would say, I need to proportion my belief to the evidence, and the belief is that the Earth is a sphere. When we consider others' claims and arguments in general, again, we've mentioned this in passing already, we want to watch out when things get heated or start to get off topic, because perhaps we can point to a few examples of this being a deliberate move, whether it's in online discussions, Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, whatever. People will often shift the focus of debate to either save face or avoid talking about the truth of a claim. There's, in fact, a specific fallacy that we'll cover later in the course when people do this deliberately. But even just on a personal level, hopefully it's clear why things often tend to fall off the rails, so to speak, when people get heated and when people might deliberately shift the focus of the conversation. And in this regard, we want to be alert to the numerous ways that critical thinking can be undermined. And oftentimes, we want to ensure that nothing has been left out, especially in online discussions. Small details can matter a lot, especially when we're talking about something that's perhaps political or a policy issue and that affects other people. Small details can very often matter quite substantially. So I'd be curious to hear if you found yourself in a situation where critical thinking started to break down for any or all of these reasons. Another famous philosopher that's mentioned in the text, and one of my favorites, is 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell, famous British philosopher, mathematician, logician. He has an interesting quote here that I'd be curious to get your thoughts on. He says, "When there are rational grounds for an opinion, people are content to set them forth and wait for them to operate. In such cases, people do not hold their opinions with passion. They hold them calmly and set forth their reasons quietly. The opinions that are held with passion are always those for which no good ground exists. Indeed, the passion is the measure of the holder's lack of rational conviction." So I want to perhaps let this sit for a second and see if you can understand what Russell is trying to say and whether or not you agree with him. And we can chat about that in person or in an online discussion. So another major topic in the text is group-centered thinking. This is something that we'll return to repeatedly. And this is broken down into a few categories. The first category is pointing out that we humans obviously spend a great deal of time trying to conform to or be part of groups, whether it's in high school, whether it's a circle of friends, family members, our cities, communities, states, governments, all kinds of groups would fall in. And we often want to conform. We want to be accepted. And that's an understandable component of human interaction, right? That we want to be accepted and conform to certain norms and certain beliefs. That's completely understandable. And biology has a lot to say about this, and certainly psychology, that our notions of community are intricately tied to our notions perhaps of survival. We want to belong, we want the safety and comfort of numbers, and we want the approval of our beloved tribe, whatever that looks like. But this is a critical thinking class, so we might immediately ask, when and how can this be problematic? Well, trouble often appears when our conformism hampers or obliterates critical thinking. In our quest to be accepted or conform to a particular group, we accept a view or a belief that's not backed by good reasons. So group-centered thinking examples, I'm sure we can think of quite a few. Again, this is not exhaustive. Prejudice, right? In its broadest sense, a judgment or opinion, whether positive or negative, based on insufficient reasons, can certainly violate our notions of critical thinking. Bias or biases, this is perhaps another word for prejudice, but we may be consciously unaware of them. So there's been a greater emphasis in the scientific and philosophical literature recently about implicit bias and conversations about policing implicit bias in academia, in lots of different areas of life, that we may even have biases that we're unaware of. And how do we counteract that? Obviously, an example that comes to mind immediately is racism, but also other isms, sexism, ableism, lots of other isms. And in its broadest sense, right, these isms capture a lack of respect for the value and rights of people of different races or geographical origins or ages or gender identification or sexual identification. So lots of isms could crop up here, and this can often be traced back to group-centered thinking, right, and how it can be problematic. So perhaps you can think of another example of a prejudice or bias that affects others. that would be an example of a group-centered violation of critical thinking. Peer pressure, obviously a big part of social interactions, but we'll see this in specific fallacies: appeals to the masses or appeals to popularity, appeal to common practice. So we'll talk more about those examples when we get to fallacies. Stereotyping is another example of group-centered thinking. This is when we classify individuals into groups according to oversimplified or prejudiced attitudes or opinions. Certainly an example. Here's one that just a silly but accurate one that I've heard, that all Italians must be in the mafia. Certainly if you grow up in an area where there aren't too many other Italian people, then people tend to, perhaps assume the worst with respect to that stereotype. It often doesn't help if your father looks like Tony Soprano as well. So that, as my dad does. So simple example of a stereotype, but there are lots of other much more serious stereotypes that can be quite harmful. So I think stereotyping is a good example of a group-centered thinking. So you can come up with an example of each, of peer pressure and stereotype. So I'll skip over this. We'll do this kind of practice later. So moving on to the wrap up of category 1 obstacles, the book really emphasizes, and I quite agree, the urge to resist contrary evidence. And this has been exacerbated by online discussions and the modes in which we communicate online, perhaps. So humans have the documented psychological tendency to resist views and evidence that conflict with their strongly held pre-existing beliefs, right? So I think this picture captures it quite nicely, right? We live in an age where if we don't like the view or don't want to be exposed to it, we just turn it off, right? It's a button or a flip of a switch, or we just ghost somebody, right? And while understandable, the problem is we're then not exposed to views that might challenge us or press us or force us to re-examine what we believe and why we believe it. So how do we avoid this? Well, we need to make a conscientious effort to look for opposing evidence or reasons to a claim or argument. This is one of the things that I would argue philosophy does quite well. We have to consider other arguments, even conclusions that we don't agree with, and we have to discuss it in a respectful and civil manner. Again, it doesn't mean that we have to agree with other people. It means that we want to discuss these issues because I would argue that's how we make progress. That's how we come to understand other people's point of view, other people's experiences. And I don't want to live in an echo chamber. And I think we could even say a lot of things on a personal level about wanting to be exposed to new things, whether it's new people, new languages, new experiences, new food. And that's not going to happen when we just stay in our own cluster, right? So there's lots of ways we could frame this, but certainly I think making a conscientious effort to look for opposing evidence or reasons to a specific claim or argument is a great place to start. And this leads to confirmation bias, which we've mentioned already. This is the documented tendency to seek out and use only confirming evidence. I think social media is a prime example for one's own pre-existing view or opinion. How do we avoid this? Again, we need to make a conscientious effort to look for opposing evidence or reasons to a claim or argument. Now, I want to be very clear here. It doesn't mean that, let's say, I'm writing a paper on the Holocaust. This does not mean that I need to consider in great detail the view that the Holocaust was a hoax, right? That's not a 50-50 discussion. Doesn't mean that we need to go down the social media rabbit hole and look for the most unsupported views or opinions that are out there, right? But certainly in a lot of other discussions, or most all discussions, there are reasonable differing opinions, whether it's about the death penalty or things like even abortion or euthanasia or tax policy, religion, right? People have different views. So I think it does mean that we, in a reasonable, rational fashion, we can look for and consider other arguments and reasons, and we should do that. But it doesn't mean that we need to consider every view on a specific topic, because that would be completely unrealistic to expect that we could do that. Another psychological hindrance is availability error. And this is when we rely on evidence, not because it's trustworthy, but because it's memorable or striking. So this is a very common error. How do we avoid this? Well, again, we must look for evidence that's not just psychologically available. Otherwise, we commit hasty generalizations. So we often will see something on the internet or see something on TV or something that is just so memorable or striking, we assume that it's trustworthy, right? And I think a good example of this would be clickbait, right? Publications or certain websites will put a catchy title that you just can't avoid clicking on. And because you are struck by it or it's particularly memorable, you might assign more credibility to the claim than is warranted. So we want to be careful to avoid that. Motivated reasoning is mentioned in the text. This is the reasoning for the purpose of supporting a predetermined conclusion, not to uncover the truth. This would be an example of what I would call confirmation bias on overdrive. So if I've already made up my mind that I'm going to do X, then I'm going to do everything in my power to try to convince other people that X should occur. When there might be stronger reasons against what I'm trying to accomplish, and I don't consider those. Maybe this might be the kind of reasoning that lawyers might need to use in some cases justifiably, but in other cases, if we've already predetermined what we want to happen, we're certainly not going to look for contrary evidence, right? We need to be reasonably skeptical and be wary of our assessments of sources that confirm our pre-existing beliefs. And we do not dismiss opposing views out of hand. Again, does not mean that all opposing views are equally plausible, but it doesn't mean that we should dismiss them out of hand before even considering them. And we want to break out, I would say, of the filter bubble or the echo chamber that can be social media, friends, and family. Because when we're just exposed to the same view all the time, then this leads to conformism. And that conformism is, I would say, in tension with our notions of critical thinking in many cases. Okay, homophily is another common one that's mentioned in the text. This is the tendency to give more credence to a statement or argument if it comes from someone you know. I mean, certainly we're all guilty of this. And it's understandable that we trust friends and family or maybe someone you know. But I think a great example of this would be advertising, right? If you see a celebrity or someone you know, musician, whatever, who's advocating a product or selling you something or telling you to invest in this cause, that's great. But the problem is we often tend to give more credit or credence to a belief or view when it comes from someone we're already familiar with, which is why companies hire celebrities and other well-known people to market their products. But we need to remember that knowing someone does not in itself lend extra credence to a statement or argument. You might find that person trustworthy. That's great, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the claim or argument in question is true or valid. Another one mentioned is the mere exposure effect. This is the tendency to become increasingly sympathetic to a view or argument upon repeated exposure to it. This is a common tactic where if we essentially just flood an audience with a message so many times, people are gonna buy it, right? It's just truth by repetition. And media companies know that they're doing this. Apps do this, social media apps. If you just expose someone to enough of these triggers, then they're more likely to either believe it or buy it or both, right? How do we avoid this? Well, we need to remember that frequency or the availability of something does not in itself lend extra credence to a statement or argument. Another one is the illusion of truth effect. And this is the tendency to become increasingly sympathetic to a view or argument upon repeated exposure to it when it's presented as truth. Okay, so a little bit different and a little more on the news side of this. So something is passed off as truth. And I would also say examples of this in online news would would be to presuppose that everyone knows this. So there are politicians, in fact, one very famous one, where you just say, well, everyone knows that, or everyone's talking about this, or everyone already understands this. When you say that enough, then it just starts to sound like everyone's already in agreement on it. It's already accepted conventional truth. But just because someone says that it's an accepted fact, or even if someone just keeps repeating it or presents the illusion that it's an established truth, does not make the thing or argument in question true. Okay, so we really want to be careful of that. The false consensus effect, right? Similar to what I just said, tendency to overestimate the degree to which people agree with a position. So I think likes or comments on a Facebook or Twitter post or whatever, even if 1,000 people like it, what's a good example? Well, lots of people go online and buy certain, I don't know, maybe healing crystals. Well, just because a lot of people like it doesn't mean that it makes it any more scientifically viable, right? Okay, something that we definitely need to talk about in the 21st century is the Dunning-Kruger effect. So this is the well-documented phenomenon of being ignorant of how ignorant we are, or overestimating our knowledge on a subject. So what does this mean? It means when we ask people to perform a task or ask them to assess their own knowledge about something in particular that they really don't know anything about, they will overestimate their abilities, whereas someone who's actually trained or has studied in that particular area will have a much more appropriate amount of self-awareness and knowledge, or awareness of the knowledge, than someone who doesn't. So what does that mean? The people who are worse at something claim to be better than they actually are. Okay, so whether it's, for example, let's say, I read a couple books about car mechanics, or the mechanics of an engine, and then I turn around and someone asks me, hey, how much do you know about changing these engine parts? And I say, yeah, I know everything there is. No, I don't. I'm grossly overestimating how good at performing that task I am. Sometimes it happens in academic circles, right? Or context. Someone might have read one philosopher, for example, which happens in some of my classes, and then they think they know everything about philosophy. And while I appreciate that attempt, reading one philosopher or one book once does not make one an expert on something, right? So we have this well-documented tendency to overestimate how good at performing a task we are. So here's a kind of a funny picture that I put on here. I don't know if you can read this, but right, here's our confidence levels, here's our wisdom, how much we know about something, right? So it starts low, and we're on the top of Mount Stupid, but yet we claim I know everything, right? And then we might decline a little bit into the valley of despair, and we might, let's say we're talking about philosophy or physics or whatever subject we're talking about. Then we start to realize, wait, there's a lot more to this than I thought. Things are a lot more complicated and intricate than I realized, right? And then you might get to the point where you say, I'm never going to understand this. But then you start rising on the slope of enlightenment, right? We might say it's starting to make sense. And then we might get to the point, and I certainly feel this way about philosophy. Trust me, it's complicated. And even in a lifetime, I'm never going to understand everything. That's okay. But we live in a society where people who don't know as much as, say, experts claim to know everything, even more so than the people who have spent a lot of time figuring stuff out. So I think a good example of this would be climate change, right? People who have spent their whole lives getting PhDs in physics and chemistry and earth sciences are being overshadowed by people who don't have that scientific background, who claim that they know more about climate change than people who've spent their entire lives, right, who are on this side of the curve, right? So whatever example you think of, I think there are lots of examples to consider here, but we really want to be aware of this effect, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Okay, I'm going to go through category 2 obstacles really quickly because this has already run longer than I had hoped, but Really good, interesting examples here in this chapter. So I hope you agree. So category 2 obstacles are philosophical hindrances. So one thing that's mentioned in the text, which I like, is this concept of a worldview. And this is there's a number of ways we could frame this. It's a philosophy of life, a set of fundamental beliefs and ideas that often act as filter to how we process information and interpret the world. So what's an example of a worldview? I think there are lots. So this could be our religion or lack of religion. This could be our political beliefs. This could be how we were raised, right? What kind of socioeconomic position we grew up in. All those things and more can affect our worldview, how we choose to see the world. But it can also act as a filter, both for good and for bad, right? And this goes back to the category 1 hindrances in many respects. But to understand worldviews and how they act as filters, I think the camera lens is a good analogy here, right? So our existing beliefs shape what information we accept or not. Worldviews can be shaped by so many different factors: political, religious, and cultural influences, among others. And I think we're seeing that right now with the COVID situation and right, the vaccine rollout in particular. If we've already been shaped to feel a certain way about, let's say, science or a particular development, of course, we're going to be more prone to dismiss it or think that it's a conspiracy, right? And so worldviews can be incredibly important for good and bad, but we need to be aware that we often come to the world, or maybe we always come to the world, with pre-existing lenses on, and that can lead to confirmation bias. So we really want to be careful with that. A specific philosophical hindrance is subjective relativism. And this is an increasingly popular view that people hold. And I'm going to say that it doesn't mean that this view cannot be supported, but if you're going to support this view or hold this view, then you've got some serious problems to account for. There are some serious criticisms of this view. So subjective relativism is the view that truth, moral truth or otherwise, depends solely on what someone believes, that truth is entirely relative to individuals. So to use an example, Seattle is the capital of Washington. That's my truth. Now, if you say, no, it's Olympia, Anthony, then I simply respond with, that's your truth. My truth is Seattle's the capital. That makes it really hard to interact in a society, right? When we've got everyone just making up their own reality, it makes it really hard to dialogue, to accomplish things, to solve problems, social or otherwise. But philosophically, this view also has problems, which I'll get to in a second. Subjective relativism is different than what we call social relativism, which is the view that truth, moral or otherwise, is relative to societies. So whether we want to frame that as American society or even different subsets of American society. So yeah, here's another example of subjective relativism. The earth is flat because I believe it is, right? Or the earth is flat because my society believes it. Both of these views, while popular to some degree, again, problems. They imply that persons and societies are infallible, that people or societies can never be wrong. So if relativism is true, you can never tell somebody that they're wrong, but that seems really untenable, right? Don't we want to say that the people that think that the earth is flat, like that's their opinion, but they're wrong, right? I mean, that seems completely counterintuitive to say that everyone is right and no one is wrong. I mean, that seems just really untenable in any deep philosophical sense. Second, they are potentially self-defeating. So consider this statement: truth is relative. Well, if truth is relative, then how can this statement be true? Because this isn't a statement, this is an objective statement that all truth is relative, but that can't be true and this be true. So we've got a logical problem here. So we can talk more about this in discussion. Right, this is a global claim that holds for everyone, but relativism cannot make global claims, right? Because truth is only supposed to hold for individual persons by definition. So they got a logical problem to solve here. The other problem, which is less well I would say less popular than perhaps it used to be, is philosophical skepticism. And this is the view that we know much less than we think we know, or nothing at all. One form of this view says that knowledge requires certainty. This goes back to some earlier views in early modern philosophy, or perhaps academic skepticism. This is the view that knowledge requires certainty, so we either know very little or nothing at all. So maybe on the other end of the relativism spectrum, we have skepticism, which is just, we can't really know anything at all. But the problem with that is that it seems like we do have knowledge about some things, even if we don't have absolutely conclusive reasons. We have good enough reasons, we might argue. Two, skepticism might also be self-defeating. So consider this claim: I know nothing. Well, if I know nothing, then don't I know something? So which is it, right? That's problematic. So hopefully you're appreciating these kind of philosophical puzzles here. So again, this is a global claim that holds for everyone, but skepticism cannot make global claims that hold for everyone by definition. Okay. So anyway, I've kind of rushed through this, but it's gone longer than I wanted, but hopefully you're enjoying thinking about these biases and obstacles to critical thinking and how to avoid them. And as always, please let me know if you have any specific questions about anything in this lecture. All right. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.